Good afternoon and welcome to this gathering in remembrance and hope, an opportunity for us to come together in the very midst of an ongoing pandemic to reflect upon it because we can. For 18 months we have not been able to assemble as we do right now, despite this afternoon's protective protocols. We gather because the pandemic has taken and continues to reap the lives of a staggering number of human beings on campus, within our lives, across the country, and around the world. We have a need to gather to remember and to give thanks for them. And we gather in hope that we are learning something from all that we are enduring, that the multiple losses, changes, fractures, and challenges we've experienced actually can be openings to new wisdom, new practices, new policies, new pedagogies, that our suffering will not be fruitless, but rather will expand our humanity, manifested in the ways we conduct ourselves day in and day out. We come together now that we may be intentional about what we make the outcomes of this crisis, how we decide to live and to do our work, and what and whom we decide to honor. My deepest thanks to those who will speak today, and to you in this lovely sanctuary, and those watching around the country and around the globe. May all whom we remember in our own hearts enjoy profoundest peace, and may all for which we hope come true in power. Our first speaker today was to be Amari Tankard, a graduate student. Amari has to be away today with her lab. She and others were invited a year ago to submit the name of a loved one who had died of COVID, and those people are memorialized in lawn signs in front of Murray Dodge Hall still. And Amari sent us a beautiful photo and some words about her father. And then tragically, a few months later, she sent us more about his mother. Her grandmother perished as well, and we are reminded of the generational effects of COVID in families. So our hearts continue to go out to the Tankard family today. So next I'd like to call to the lectern Albert Rivera.
Good afternoon. Like many of you, I was in lockdown last year, only going out for the most basic of necessities. And like so many others, I still to this day struggle with a time distortion where things or meetings that happened yesterday seem like long ago. What I'm about to share with you came to pass during our darkest days when folks were still disinfecting groceries and quarantining deliveries. These events to me seem like yesterday, even though they took place well over a year ago. My mom, who still lives in my old neighborhood of Washington Heights in Manhattan, called me frantically one evening that my brother was sick and in the hospital. Her despair made me shudder. I tried to settle her down as best I could and started making calls myself. When I finally reached my brother, I found out that he and my sister-in-law had both gone to the hospital together with severe symptoms. He was told to go home, and they admitted his wife. Not long after came the familiar pattern of ICU, ventilator, seeming recovery and hope, and then the call that it was time to say goodbye. My sister-in-law, Lillian Rivera, spent most of her professional life fighting for justice for victims of lead poisoning. Not bad. She left behind a husband, 4 adult children, and a grandchild. I think I was a teenager when she and my brother started dating. And it's funny that the most lasting recollection I have is that I thought she was so cool. In the late 70s and early 1980s, Washington Heights, which is where I grew up, if you had a nice job, nice clothes, and remember that was the disco era, and an apartment, then you were cool. We shared so many laughs over the years, and that's what I'm going to remember the most about her, including the time she delivered an indecent gesture to an aggressive driver who was honking the horn repeatedly at her, only to find out that it was the pastor of her church trying to get her attention. Around that same period last year, I received word that our longtime Davis International Center volunteer, Hannah Han, passed away unexpectedly and joined her dear husband, Sam, who had left us several years earlier. Not long before, Hannah had a knee replacement and was back in the office in about 1 week. I think it was just in her DNA to help people, and she would not be deterred by anything, especially not a new joint. Hannah was not just a volunteer. She was part of our Davis IC family, an institution in her own right, serving the international community at Princeton for decades. Hannah was tough, opinionated, at times irreverent, funny, direct, and oh so kind. Just a beautiful soul. If she liked you, you could get away with a few things, like forgetting to invite her to a staff event, which unfortunately I did a few times. My friends, you don't know what dry mouth is until you're looking for Hannah to tell her you were the one that forgot to invite her. But she would make a joke and be so nice about it. If she did not like you, well, you knew that too, and you probably were told why. Hannah impacted many thousands of lives here at Princeton with her acts of service for international students, scholars, and their families. If you ever wondered if volunteerism makes a difference, look no further than Hannah. Personally, I felt her genuine affection, and I cherished the many one-on-one chats we were able to have. I regret not taking the time to ask more questions about her life story and telling Hannah how much her kindness meant to me. Like many others, I thought I had more time. Speaking of stories, I've been a Methodist for all my life, and it's taken me 57 years and a global pandemic to truly understand the purpose and power of parables, of stories, the lasting impression of a life story shared, and the infinite blessings that can come with making connections. Stories, much like kindness, go a long way and are not easily forgotten. So my friends, my wish, my prayer for all of us on this day of remembrance is this: take the time to listen, to get to know and support each other, to say thank you, to love, to laugh, be vulnerable, trust, share your story, be kind to yourself, forgive yourself and others. Don't be afraid to get help and give help. We will fail often, and we will falter just as much. It's okay. Get back up, forgive, and try again. The past year and a half tugged at the very fabric of our being. And yet in the middle of this, I can see light in the utter joy of having 2 beautiful, and I mean adorable, babies added to the Davis IC family this past year. and we're expecting a third early next year. I see the transformative power of connections. When Davis IC student leaders helped turn a group of 130 shy first-year international students into dynamic, vibrant, can't keep them quiet students by day 3 of international orientation. We're still going through tough times. Many of us are scared for ourselves, for our loved ones, especially the children. We feel confused, frustrated, displaced, just plain tired. You are not alone. But if we stick together as a community and are willing to give grace and receive it, I can see a new Princeton on the other side. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank everyone here for the opportunity to speak very briefly about my mother, Geneva, who died of COVID-19 in May 2020. What immediately comes to mind when I think of my mother is time lost. 1,262,304,000 seconds. 21,038,400 minutes, 350,640 hours, 14,610 days, 2,087 weeks, 480 months, and 40 years. I did not know my mother, Geneva. To be more specific, I did not have an adult relationship with her. Through a series of very unfortunate events, I chose to walk away from relationship with my mother at age 18, and I chose not to communicate with her. At the time, I believed the relationship was so severely broken that as I made my own way in life, I even lost track of where my mother resided. Months turned into years, and there was no communication. Not for 40 years. This all changed on May 5th, 2020, when I received a voice message at my place of work, which I can only describe as divinely providential, because for a full 2 years prior to receiving that message, I felt compelled to pray. And I asked God to allow me to unite with my mother. The voice message in May was his answer to my prayers. I learned that my mother was living in a nursing home in New Jersey and that she recently was transferred to a hospital because of her severe symptoms after contracting COVID-19. I was and still am beyond grateful to have had the opportunity to see my mother again, albeit through the medium of FaceTime over a nurse's iPhone. The first 2 days, my mother was not responsive. But by day 3 of my daily phone calls, a miracle happened. My mother's illness paused for a few days. She did not require oxygen, and therefore she and I was able to both see and talk with each other through FaceTime. After 40 long years. Those few days before my mother's passing, 5 days later, was a precious gift both she and I thoroughly enjoyed. So here's some of what I've chosen to first remind myself and then ask myself from that experience. I remind myself, all of us are allotted the same number of seconds, minutes, and hours each day. And if we're fortunate, we still may have a few more journeys around the sun. And I ask myself, in what way will I spend my remaining time? Will I continue along the path of unforgiveness and misunderstanding? Will I choose to embrace judgmentalism and division? I pray not. For life truly is a gift, and tomorrow is not promised to any of us. I close by sharing the final verse from one of my favorite scriptures found in 1 Corinthians 13. It reads, "Three things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love." Rest well, Geneva. I love you. Thank you.
Take a moment just to notice the silence around you. Allow your face to soften and your chest to soften. Maybe notice silence inside as well, just for a moment.
Good afternoon. As we gather today to remember those we have lost, I come to you nursing fresh grief as my family mourns the passing of my mother-in-law, a tidal force for good, an indefatigable wonder worker, and a wizard cook who made an impeccably divine lentil soup. In her honor, I come today to offer brief remarks on hope, taking as my theme the lessons of the pandemic for us as teachers and students. The sudden precipitation into online teaching in March 2020, the redesign of courses around asynchronous and synchronous virtual options in fall 2020 and spring 2021, the cresting burnout of my students, and my own rapidly escalating sense of depletion in late spring 2021, and now the conditional and precarious return to face-to-face instruction this fall. So much has happened in these past 18 months to shake and remold my understanding of what it means to be a responsible educator. I have grown firmer, and I would like to think stronger, in the commitment to honest exposition of my own ethical sensibilities, in dialogue with students and colleagues and all who are involved in the delicate world building that a genuinely just and anti-racist institution will require. But delicate is key here. On the one hand, the nourishing and sustaining good of physical co-presence and dialogue has never seemed more urgent, so necessary. And yet my patience for the whataboutism of folks who are always seeking to redirect the conversation away from any focused consideration of structural and systemic racism and its manifestations in the time of the pandemic has vanished. How do I break bread with folks who would slight the suffering of the Black and brown communities that reared and nurtured me, or whose only response to the summons of reckoning is to burrow inward into their wounded vanity? The pandemic and my students have taught me to be more intentional and directional in my work, and to balance the need to practice generosity with the self-care of not wasting time in delivering myself to or extricating myself from the traps set by folks who are not living this struggle. In the hot days of Zoom teaching and endless online disagreements about the futures of my field and related humanities disciplines, Kyla Wazana Tompkins' essay in PMLA, "The Shush was a glass of cold water." She writes, and I'll quote her, "I thought about what people of color, Black and Indigenous folks, say to each other when our coworkers are not in the room, who we warn each other about, how we tell each other to stay reality-based to protect our energy, how we sit around and ask each other, what is the matter with this discipline, man? And out from under the heavy unsayables of this difficult time, we are hopefully, but perhaps not emerging from, into what will be a continuing struggle. My question is simple: what will make us better? How can we be better in this world right now? What I mean by better is this: are we going to sink deeper into this crisis, this ecological crisis, the wavering of already fragile and dubiously democratic institutions, these expressions of racism that ripple across the scale from the curricular to state violence? Are we going to continue to ritually lament the past? What is the movement from protestation and statements to action and change?" End quote. For me, one answer to that question has involved grace. In the language of the promise that appears on the syllabi for my lectures and seminars, "Because your welfare as human beings is what matters above everything else, I am committed to being as flexible as possible in the administration of this course and in the assessments of your work, and I ask that you extend me the grace of flexibility too." In concrete terms, why am I going to chastise or torment students over missed deadlines or adhere to rigid and unbending standards of evaluation when I can, by exercising grace and compassion, in the knowledge that my students' excellence will shine all the more because of that grace and compassion, can lead them to joining us in building a better Princeton? But I'm also seeking to heed the call to serve in more varied and multidimensional ways. At the end of one of the recorded lectures for the Citizenships Ancient and Modern class that I taught last fall, I shared with the students a few sentences from the Puerto Rican playwright Guiara Alegría Judez's response to the Black classicist and philosophers Daniel Allen's Tanner lectures on democracy and education. Here are the sentences that moved me from Judez's litany of wishes for her cousins as they fight to assert control over their lives amidst the violence of the prison industrial complex. Quote, "I want them to notice, too, the pockets of their lives where vibrancy lives and breathes, though these things may also seem so obvious as to be unremarkable. The oral histories passed through generations, the recipes of poor elders that nurture an impressive amount of bellies, the gift culture where neighbors informally provide daycare and food services to each other in times of sickness, the willingness to risk imprisonment by joining a community in unapologetic protest, the generations upon generations who have served in our armed conflicts. How Abuela once told me, if you can't afford baby powder, put some cornstarch on the baby's butt, and the notion that humility is the highest virtue, the reverence for community members who are servicial, of service," end quote. My hope is that we strive to build a world in the time of the pandemic and in whatever comes next, where being servicial is revered. This world-building demands that we generalize the living example of our most overlooked community members into a precept for right behavior, without once again sidelining these community members or being duped into the exploitation of their and our service by those structures that delight in exacting free labor. In other words, the practice of being servicial cannot be severed from conscious acknowledgement of poverty and racism with their many tessellations of violence, as these pervade this institution and many others. Our future begins with the recognition of systemic violence past and present, with a discernment of what we will need to do and whom we will need to serve if there ever is to be justice, and with the vow to keep our eyes on the prize and our gaze unobstructed by distractions. The day is short and the work is much, as Rabbi Tarfon, a denizen of the world that I study, said some 2 millennia ago. And while, quote, it is not your responsibility to finish the work, neither are you free to desist from it. Thank you very much.
As we hear words of hope from others, we have the opportunity to join our voices together as well in this song called The Tree of Life. It's a beautiful image that crosses religious and spiritual boundaries, a place perhaps of hope and growth and faith. And since it's probably new, we'll take just a moment to learn it together. There are things that we know that we don't know we know. Just try that. There are things that we know that we don't know we know. Come to the tree of life. Your turn. Come to the tree of life. There are things that we know that we don't know we know. Here we go. There are things that we know that we don't know we know. Come to the tree of life. Come to the tree of life. And then we have this chorus. Come to the tree of life. Come to the tree of life. Here we go. Come to the tree of life. Come to the tree of life. There are things that we know that we don't know we know. Come to the tree of life. There are things that we know that we don't know we know. Come to the tree of life. And now we'll take just a moment to sing it all the way through together.
Good afternoon. I'm going to touch on themes of community, and I can't help but think of one perennially strong locus of community here at Princeton, which is the writing seminar program. As most of you know, or some of you may know, all first-year students are required to take a semester-long writing seminar, a program which contributes in many ways to community at Princeton. To name a few, it introduces students to an intimate seminar setting. It instills the precepts of an academic community in scholarly conversation. And from time to time, it gives us a common enemy in our noble struggle to complete the first year. One standout memory from my writing seminar was an assigned reading by 20th century philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy. Reading the piece, I couldn't help but believe it was assigned tongue-in-cheek because of passages like this one that I had to go find. Being singular plural means the essence of being is only a coessence. In turn, coessence, or being with, designates the co, or even more so, the co itself in the position or guise of an essence. In fact, coessentiality cannot consist in an assemblage of essences where the essence of the assemblage as such remains to be determined. And there were like hundreds of pages of this. So no, I have no idea what I just quoted to you all, but what I do remember from my professor's explanation the following day is that the text represented a philosophical underpinning for the importance of community to our very existence as individuals. This unintelligible philosophical language is hardly sufficient solace during a time when community worldwide has been threatened in ways none of us had seen in our lifetimes. Worse yet, the pandemic seemed to challenge the very logic, if you can find it, of that philosophical argument, that to exist is to exist in community. We seemingly mastered virtual remote learning and working, refining our strategies as far as entry and exit, audio and video, and ultimately accomplishing the work we set out to do. We developed completely new instincts when we encountered others, reflexively leaning away or stepping down off the sidewalk to maximize distance. I, for one, instinctively panicked when watching a movie or a show that depicted large celebratory gatherings like the ones we have here at Princeton to decompress on the weekends or to commemorate traditional milestones. And these were, even if the film was 10 years ago. The complete mastery of new tools, the rewiring of our visceral reactions to other people, these were adaptations that both facilitated our pre-pandemic pursuits and their continuation, and ultimately saved lives. So do we really need human connection to thrive? Of course, our communities suffered from more than just the inconveniences of pandemic life. Johns Hopkins reports over 4.5 million deaths from COVID worldwide, dozens of which, maybe more, impacted the Princeton community, as the memorial outside Murray Dodge attests to, and as the testimonies today do as well. These were loving family members, critical mentors, indispensable leaders, joy-bringing children. And the tear in our communities went beyond those lost just to the disease. Other circumstances, related or not, even random or not, exacerbated the losses caused by the pandemic. In the spring, our community suffered immensely with the loss of one of our classmates. Though he was hundreds of miles away, Princeton was in pain. In a letter I wrote to the student body at the time, I submitted that reconceiving of ourselves as a community, rather than taking that for granted, and acting with the compassion that implied, was our best response, indeed our only response. Even in a world of little face boxes on a screen, Princetonians reflected on what this loss meant to all of us and remained steadfast in our support for one another. In other words, we needed our community in order to heal. But for many, our communities themselves might still feel like they are healing. How do we return to a world of greater human connection after the losses our communities have sustained? How do we rebuild community here at Princeton and beyond? I think we can do it both top-down and bottom-up. First, although the pandemic in many senses isolated us as individuals, it also revealed that all 8 billion of us are in many ways a single community, because actions on one side of the globe impacted people on the other. This has inspired public health interventions, miracle vaccinations, and calls for global justice that acknowledge the interrelatedness of distant lives, the disproportionate losses certain communities continue to face, and the unarmed sameness of each of us against an external threat. This global sense of community seems to me a tremendously important lens for everyone, from international policymakers to undergraduate students developing our lives' goals and priorities. To embed inclusive definitions of community in our technology, writing, and policy is one clear lesson from the pandemic that will serve us well to heed. Second, though, for many of us, we may be more capable of rebuilding community in our immediate surroundings and on a more manageable scale. Jesus told his disciples, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." Surely by gathering together in the name of love and compassion and forgiveness, Jesus would even enter a Zoom room, or metaphorically so, to keep his promise. Or more broadly speaking, that essence of being that Nancy formulated can be restored. The young narrator, Esther, in Dickens's Bleak House, reminds her older readers that often the best way to build community is to start small. I thought it best, she considers, to be as useful as I could and to render what kind services I could to those immediately about me, and to try to let that circle of duty gradually and naturally expand itself. In other words, we might be best equipped to begin with the 2 or 3 around us, but that won't prevent us from scaling our community when we feel ready to. Princeton at its best can be a large community composed of many smaller communities. Z groups, student organizations, tight roommates, precepts, thesis advisor and advisee. Some of these groups grow with time, and some thrive best just as small as they are. One beautiful aspect of Princeton is that whenever you walk from point A to point B, or enter any space, there will always be some people you know, other people you know only by name, and others you don't know at all. It is comfortable enough that the seeds of community are always planted, but not cozy enough that you don't feel compelled to meet others, learn their perspectives, and allow both your communities to grow. As we do a lot more walking around campus from point A to point B and entering physical spaces this year, I hope we can harness the spirit of community as much in a time of hope as we did during a time of despair, because we need it now just as then. As I can barely make out that philosopher said, the essence of being is only a coessence, or a community, and I'll add that the essence of Princeton is too.
When COVID first struck, Lakia Higbee was working at Stone Gardens assisted living center in Cleveland, Ohio. When Stone Gardens closed because of the pandemic, Lakia lost her job. She found new work as an Amazon picker, fetching bleach and cat food and anything else American consumers wanted. In November, she contracted the virus at Amazon, she thinks, and was sent home, where she laid in bed and tried to breathe. Lakia slowly recovered, but it was a month of no money, she told me. She hadn't worked long enough at Amazon to qualify for paid time off. Lakia clocked back in a month later, but she could never get enough hours to catch up on the rent. Then February arrived, and her life began to unfurl. Out of the blue, Lakia started having seizures. She'd convulse while on Zoom with her psychiatrist or playing with her granddaughters. The seizures prevented her from returning to work. The next month, her landlord served her with an eviction notice, the first Lakia had ever received in her life. She was terrified, but she had heard the government wasn't allowing evictions like hers to move forward. She looked into it, filled out the paperwork, claimed sanctuary. Early last September, the Centers for Disease Control issued a national eviction moratorium that lasted 331 days. For the better part of a year, for the first time in our nation's history, millions of Americans could worry about something else for a change. For Lakia, it was her health. She was able to build a care team focused on her seizures, to be admitted to the hospital for testing. She found a lawyer who helped her apply for disability. A local nonprofit with federal funds recently paid off her rental debt, making her family and her landlord whole again. We're not on the road to eviction anymore, she told me. The moratorium, it saved us. The eviction moratorium stopped over 4 million people from losing their homes during a deadly pandemic. A study published at the beginning of this year found that moratoriums reduced COVID deaths by 11%. Next to vaccines and masking, this was the most important public health intervention instated during COVID. Imagine if the moratorium hadn't existed. Imagine if Lakia had to face not only her seizures, but the violence of eviction too. So what do I hope? I hope we don't go back to normal. Normal meant living in the richest democracy with the worst poverty. I once spent a lot of time in Milwaukee following families getting evicted. Met a mother named Marlene. One day she was evicted by surprise. Men just showed up at her home and started stuffing her belongings in giant black bags. And then her 7-year-old came home from school. And he took in the scene, all these strangers and this chaos and his mom running around trying to find the medication and the cell phone, and he said nothing. He didn't ask a question, he didn't fetch his favorite toy, he didn't cry. He just turned around and went outside. He had seen it before. Do we want to go back to that normal? I don't. Though what gives me hope is that we as a nation during this moment of deep peril acted with conviction and strength to protect our most vulnerable families in ways that were frankly unprecedented. Because of the massive investments made in the American people in the form of pandemic relief, stimulus checks, rental assistance, expanded unemployment insurance, poverty in our country did not increase during the worst economic downturn in nearly a century. Poverty fell, and by a tremendous amount. We lost 10 million jobs during the pandemic, but 20 million fewer Americans are in poverty today than they were 3 years ago. Poverty fell most for kids. We didn't just prevent economic disaster, we nearly cut the poverty rate in half. This gives me hope. This is the kind of news that makes me want to hang out my window and bang on pots and pans and cheer like we did during the beginning of the pandemic for first responders. We have seen during this last year the boundaries of the possible flex and wane. Impossibilities have become law. It makes me want to ask for more. In March 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, I flew to Minneapolis to watch the eviction hearing of a woman named Chloe Jackson. Chloe was a single mom and a leader in a multi-ethnic tenants' rights group that for years had fought their landlord for control over their apartment. The tenants wanted to turn their run-down, long-neglected building into a co-op that they owned and managed themselves. It was an outrageous goal, requiring them to raise $7 million and convince the landlord to sell them the building. he decided to pass out eviction notices instead. Things came to a head in March. Chloe and her neighbors would either be homeowners or they'd be homeless. It was a jury trial, unusually, and the jury was taking forever in their deliberations. And as I waited for the verdict, I had thought that they had no chance of winning. But they did win. This group of tenants, made up of immigrants and working poor people who communicated across language barriers using the Google Translate app, they banded together, they beat a Goliath. And after the verdict, the tenants celebrated and hooped and hugged each other in the hallway. And some asked why the jury was taking so long. You know what took them so long? One tenant said with face tattoos. I bet the question they were held up on was, why did the tenants want a Ragley building? People don't know how to dream. People don't know how to dream. My hope for you, for me, is that we never forget how to dream. My hope is that this pandemic has taught us not to be so easily pleased.
Namaste. What has COVID taught us about living compassionately with other people, with communities, ourselves, the earth, and the world? How do we not let the suffering of this time just pass on by, without making us more intentional about living with compassion? During the pandemic, along with great loss, pain, and suffering, we have also come across moments of overwhelming gratitude for the kindnesses that have sprouted all around, with many shared expressions of love, kindness, and care. These positive experiences affirm to us that when times are difficult, our common human response is not to show reckless disregard of others, but to show compassion. We often assume that emergencies automatically lead to panic, but we have seen people act in solidarity and turn toward each other with a sense of togetherness. We have seen goodness and grace in our frontline workers and essential workers and all those who felt an inner calling to support and shield those who are most vulnerable. Many within our own Princeton community dusted off their old sewing machines and purchased fabric and elastic to make masks for those in need, while others made grocery runs and medication drop-offs for elderly neighbors and continued to spread goodwill in the community, strengthening social bonds and helping everyone be resilient together. As a child, I listened to many devotional songs, and there is one that resonated more than others. And over the years, this song has become a guiding light on my path, offering me hope, faith, love, and compassion for myself and for others, especially during challenging times. नदियाँ न पिए कभी अपना जल, वृक्ष न खाए कभी अपने फल, अपने तन का मन का धन का दूजों को दे जो दान है, वो सच्चा इंसान रे इस धरती का भगवान है. Which translates into, streams never drink their own water, nor do trees eat their own fruit. One who dedicates their body, mind, and fortune to the benefit of others is an ideal being, is a form of divinity on this earth. I feel nature reminds us that the same source and energy that fuels us and flows through the rivers and trees, flows through us. And this divine consciousness, or source energy, is pure, peaceful, radiant, joyous, loving, kind, compassionate, nourishing, and all-giving. It is that invisible thread, or live wire, that not only connects all beings, but fuels us and flows through us with unlimited potential and power. We see how this consciousness moves the sun to rise each day to offer radiance and warmth to all, and the rivers flow to quench the thirst of the land and all who walk upon it. The trees stay grounded and invite us to lean in for support, enjoy their shade, or grab a fruit that hangs before us as an offering. The flower offers to delight us with a moment to pause and enjoy its sweet fragrance. The moonlight offers us companionship of peace and calm as we lay to rest. These all selflessly serve and strive for the well-being of all those around them. And that same flow of divine consciousness moves within each one of us. We perhaps become most aware of that energy in those situations that bring us overwhelming joy or pain. That movement may give us goosebumps, the feeling of butterflies in our stomach, or anxiousness in our chest when we are presented with an opportunity for growth and expansion, or in the presence of divine thought or energy. That energy invites us to take action, and the choice to react or respond is ours. We honor and remember all those who deeply connected to this consciousness within them and responded to this call for action as an offering and service for humanity. Compassion is inherent within all individuals, particularly those who choose to serve others. And the act of compassion is kindness towards ourselves and others. In those moments when our heart aches and prays for a relief from the suffering of others, we must pause, breathe deeply, and come to a space within ourselves where we ask, how may I serve? How may I be an instrument of thy grace? What may I offer in this moment in time? How may my actions offer love, kindness, peace, and comfort? As we move forward, I leave you with an invitation in your own time and space for reflections on what compassion looks like when we are in the space of love and oneness, when the suffering of one is the sufferings of all, and when the love and kindnesses of one create ripples of goodness and grace for all. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I extend greetings to all of you who join us this afternoon, whether you do so in person here in the chapel or virtually through our broadcast. Our marvelous Dean of Religious Life, Allison Bowden, organized this gathering so that we might reflect collectively on the pandemic, both by remembering what we have been through and by imagining what we might create in the future. We need to remember, we need to grieve, to reflect, to hope, and to imagine. None of that is easy, however, not least because we are still in the pandemic. More fundamentally, it is hard, and it will remain profoundly hard, even after the pandemic eventually ends, to interpret the global, communal, and personal crises that have upended our lives for the past 18 months. Because the pandemic is hard to understand or interpret, we'll inevitably disagree with one another about its meaning and implications, just as we disagree about so many other things. And because the pandemic has affected us so personally, those disagreements will sometimes be raw, sensitive, or painful. We will need to find ways to respect and support one another through those disagreements, even though they will sometimes be uncomfortable. I confess that I do not yet feel fully ready to offer an interpretation of the pandemic, or even of my own experience in it. The best that I can offer are some tentative reflections amidst the uncertainty. Here is one simple, obvious, and important thing we know. Each of us has lost something. Millions of people worldwide have lost their lives. Millions more have had friends or family members taken from them. I extend my condolences and sympathies to the Princetonians who spoke so movingly today, and to everyone who has lost loved ones during this pandemic. Others, myself included, have been unlucky enough to keep our health, our families, our homes, and our jobs. But we too have lost precious things: scholarly or personal projects, concerts and competitions, trips, shared meals, the simple joys of personal companionship and new acquaintances, rituals and celebrations, such as graduations, weddings, anniversaries, birthdays, and funerals to honor those whom we've lost. Whatever you have lost, be sure of this: it matters. We must give ourselves permission to reflect on and grieve for the pandemic's effects upon us, even if we count ourselves relatively fortunate by comparison to others. We need to heal, and we cannot heal unless we are honest about what we have felt. And here is a second thing we know, an obvious corollary of the first. As we acknowledge our own losses, we need to recognize that others have borne pain or stresses that we cannot see. Friends, colleagues, and neighbors upon whom we rely have been through their own pandemics, with hardships and burdens as poignant as our own. We need to support them even as we deal with our own losses. That is a demanding combination, to care conscientiously for others and ourselves in the midst and aftermath of crisis. This is not, however, merely a time of demands. It is also, as the title for today's service suggests, a time for hope. Many of us, and I hope this is true for you, have discovered that we have an opportunity to find fresh and rejuvenating joy in what we once took for granted. I expect that we each have moments to treasure as our community comes together once again in person. For me, what stands out most is hearing groups of people, in offices or courtyards, laughing together. It is for me one of the many things that make this place wonderful and this community wonderful. It is also something that I'd never paused over, never fully appreciated until the pandemic took it from us. I hope that we, all of us, can retain that heightened ability to savor and delight in ordinary things and in one another's company. We will need joy, along with courage, creativity, persistence, compassion, humility, and insight, as we make sense of the past, address the formidable challenges that confront us today, and seek to build a better future. We will need all those things, and we will also need one another. I have been grateful for the support and camaraderie of this community over the past 18 months, and I am both honored and happy to be with you today. We have much to do on the journey that lies ahead, and I look forward to continuing that journey in your company.
As we go, what do we do now? After the stories have been told, the books have been written, the words have been spoken, the song has been sung, and the tears have been shed, what do we do now? Who do we become? Who are we when the titles no longer matter, the rules are no longer the same, and we've been forever changed? Who do we become? May we go from this place not looking for easy answers nor quick fixes. May we go from this place looking deep inside and around ourselves with curiosity and a sense of awe. May we look at others and see their humanity. May we look at the sky and wonder about its infinite possibilities. And may we look at ourselves and see that we are instruments of grace, peace, mercy, justice, and love in this world. May it and we be so. Amen. Go in peace.